Good day and welcome to Critical Faculty. I'm your host, Hani Salim. Today we have a host that's been wonderful and kind to me over the years, appearing and discussing issues of philosophy and humanities. I'd like to welcome to the studio the great Dan Barker. Good day, Dan.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great. Good morning here, whatever it is for you there.
Well, it is good morning. It's 30 minutes past midnight.
Oh, okay. So we're both in morning. I'm in Wisconsin and you're in Melbourne. So
Correct,
yeah.
yes. And it's such a wonderful thing to see you again, Dan, and your continuous contribution to the thoughtfulness of humanity. I came across a situation where you are coming up with a new idea and you want to sort of structure it in a book. And that idea is quite an interesting one. And you, in the process, you coined a new term for us, or a term that has been thought about while during a debate. You first came with post-duction, which didn't sort of the probably the crowd didn't sort of understand exactly where you're coming from.
Well,
But
neither did I.
what were you trying to achieve? What was the debate about, and how did you come with the term, with the initial term?
Okay. So I've done a lot of debates. Right now, I've done 140 public, formal, moderated debates since 1985. That sounds like a lot, but spread over like 40 years, it averages out. And so I debate the existence of God. I debate morality, state-church separation, and so on. And I'm not a professional philosopher. I'm not a professional scientist. I'm a former ordained minister. I used to preach the gospel, and so that doesn't mean I know a lot. A lot of ministers get ordained easily. But during these debates, I get a chance to dig into these topics, of course. And 2 years ago, in March of 2022, I was in Florida to debate Adam Lloyd Johnson on the topic, Does God Exist? And he focused on the fine-tuning argument. And during his opening statement, he said, the fine-tuning argument is an abductive argument that leads to the suggestion that there must be an intelligent designer. And I heard that word abductive. And as I was walking up to do my opening statement, which followed his, this thought popped in my mind. Well, abductive, we're all used to deductive logic. I mean, that's pretty basic. And inductive, we all know a lot. But what do we know about abductive logic? What does abductive even mean? And I just sort of knew a little bit about what that word abductive means. Basically, and I told the audience, an abductive conclusion is really just a best guess. It's kind of an inference to the best explanation.
Mhm.
It doesn't really prove anything, but it puts an option on the table, let's say. So the suggestion that there's an intelligent designer is kind of like the suggestion that a detective in a murder case would say, well, we've come up with some suspects, and we think these might be guilty, but you still haven't even arrested them or charged them or even convicted them. You just have a suspect. And I was thinking about that word abductive, and I realized, you know what, abductive is useful. It's not a solid like deductive conclusion. It's useful, but it doesn't get you anywhere if you're pointed in the wrong direction. If you're looking somewhere in the wrong place, it doesn't get you anywhere. And this thought popped into my head. It's backward. The whole thing is backward. The whole design argument, fine tuning is backward. And so I was thinking on my feet, and I was ad-libbing, and I said, I think we need another word besides abductive. How about, and I said, how about post-ductive, where you get things wrong? Well, the audience didn't seem very impressed with that. And actually, it was a stupid thing to say. And then it was only a couple months later when I was thinking about that. It's post is the wrong prefix. I was thinking it should be something not like after the fact. It should be a prefix like inverts. So
Mhm.
I thought, well, contraductive. If something's getting backwards, it's contraductive. And so that's the origin of the book. It's sort of this sort of stupid idea in my head, and I was wondering, is this worth anything? And basically, to overly simplify, contraduction is a reversal of order. It's an informal fallacy. It's not a form of logic. There's no such thing as contraductive logic, but it's a word I'm using to explain what happens before the logic. When you're making your premises to start your logic, how do you get to those premises? And often those premises that we come up with are faulty, and we don't even know it. It's like a hidden fallacy in our brains where we get things backwards and don't even know it. And if that happens, you're starting off your entire, perhaps logically valid deductive conclusion. You're starting it off on the wrong foot because it's reversed. It's contraductive. So a silly example, I think this might have happened to you. Have you ever been sitting on a train that's not moving next to another train that's not moving, and the other train starts to move, and you very briefly think it's you who's moving? That happens to me. It could be in a car or an airplane or whatever. That happens to me a lot. Just for that brief moment, you think, oh, I'm moving, but actually it's reverse of reality. Our brains are perceiving reality, but we flip it. So it can happen with movement. It can happen with relationships. It can happen with causality. We can reverse cause and effect. It can happen with position. A really silly example, and there are some examples that are not so silly, but a silly example would be like the guy who's so impressed at how did they make all those rivers flow right along the state borders? How did they do that? To get those rivers to be finely tuned, exquisitely finely tuned to the state border, must have been a huge design project, a huge expensive civic project to get those rivers to perfectly match. Look at, it's exactly on the borders. And by the way, when they veer away from the border, they aim right to the major cities. How do you explain that design? How do you explain that correspondence there? Well, of course, that's silly. It's backwards because the rivers came first and then the borders came later. So I coined that word contraduction back in basically about 2 years ago. And since then, I've been looking up examples after examples after examples to try to explain it. And I'm suggesting to the reader, and the book is called Contradiction that's coming out. I'm explaining to the reader, some of these examples might be wrong. I might be totally off base. And if I am, let me know. In fact, some readers have let me know, pre-readers, in a very friendly way, that some of my stuff was kind of wrong. But the point is not that any particular example might be right or wrong. The point is to examine how our brains work. Well, how do we get this? How does this informal fallacy happen? And basically it happens because we tend to view the world. I think all organisms have to view the world primarily from their own point of view. Everything is happening is me and me. It's like the sunrise. When you look at the sunrise, we think the sun is going up and rising when actually it's reversed. That's a contradiction. The sun is not rising, we are rising. But from our point of view, we get it backward. We contraduce what's really happening, and we say the sunrise. I don't know what else you would call it. Maybe call it the horizon set or the horizon sink or something. But in any event, we frame reality from our own point of view. And when we do that, we make this assumption that many times gets it totally backwards. And that's sort of the essence of the book, or the idea.
And we do this all the time. I mean, when you try to explain physics, especially quantum mechanics, the language used is nowhere near what really happens in quantum mechanics. The atom doesn't have the electrons sort of zapping around, and you know the image which is on CERN at the Geneva Hadron Collider with the atom, it's actually incorrect. That's the image of, but this is the image that the human brain can conceive. Yeah. So we continuously have to use language to approximate and things that are very difficult for the brain that evolved in the savannah to survive, to understand quite abstractly. So it is difficult. I can appreciate that.
And even Richard Feynman admitted, you know, his Feynman diagrams that.
Yeah.
So he said, this is not reality. This is not what's happening, but I'm doing these diagrams just so we have a way to talk about what's happening. Please don't think this is what's happening. But
Yes, yeah. And if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't understand quantum mechanics.
Well, see, at least I don't think I understand it, so I don't have that problem.
Oh, it's still a big debate going on because that's again that's another area that needs a bit of finalization. General relativity doesn't play with quantum mechanics, and there isn't a grand unification theory for now. But that's a different conversation. But I found a formal fallacy that explains exactly what you're describing, which is completely valid, and it's called the fallacy of inversion, also known as confusion of inverse, or the inverse fallacy, where this exact scenario happens. And it actually addresses the argument from design. Have you heard about the puddle of water analogy?
Yeah, I talk about,
Yeah,
well, I use the Pacific Ocean one, but yeah.
yeah, it is very similar as well. But the puddle of water, there's water inside a puddle, and so look at this hole. It's made exactly for me. It's made exactly for my size. It fits me perfectly. But it's actually inverse because the hole exists first, and then rains, and it fills the water, and water has to sort of align with the vessel that is contained within. So it looks like as if it was made for it, but it was the other way around.
Yeah.
So the intelligent, the fine tuning could be exactly that.
Well, yeah, and that's a good example of contradiction where we get it backward. I remember when Annie Laurie and I were driving down the Pacific Coast Highway in California, almost as beautiful as the Great Ocean Road, by the way, down where you are, along the coast, I was amazed. I was thinking about, look at how perfectly the puzzle piece of the North American continent perfectly fits the puzzle piece of the Pacific Ocean. Look how those two pieces come together. How did that happen? Look at how they match each other, the coastline. Of course, that's silly. I mean, it's not, it's our brains thinking the wrong way around, contradictive. But I have to say, Henny, I don't think what you call the fallacy of inversion is the same thing as contradiction. The the fallacy of inversion is informal propositional logic, the way that you structure logic, and contradiction is in the real world. I think if I remember my logic classes, what do you call it? Modus ponens. For example, when you say if P then Q,
Hmm.
P therefore Q, which is valid, and it could be sound also. You can't formally invert. You can't formally negate that second line. You can't say if P then Q, not P therefore not Q. That doesn't follow. That's the
True.
fallacy of inversion. You're inverting not something in reality. You're inverting a, a propositional structure. What you're inverting the logic, because when you say if P then Q, you're not saying only if P then Q. So, but if you take that logic and you think you can invert it, that's a formal fallacy. And my contradiction is an informal fallacy. It has nothing to do with propositional logic. It has to
Okay.
do with how our brains are informally getting things backwards. So you can use that word inversion in all sorts of contexts. And even if someone, and I think you told me you found somebody use the word contradiction in a political context, the same word can have different usages,
Hmm.
in different contexts. So um, I'm still claiming that as far as logic goes and informal logic goes, contradiction is a new term.
Fair enough. Okay, so I get your point now. So my fallacy is more of a structural one, so therefore formal, while you're referring to informal fallacy and in inferring information about the outside world by observing it. I can see the difference. I can see the difference quite clearly, and I would actually tend to agree now that you've clarified this position. I can see now the distinction. You're referring more to the informal fallacy rather than the formal fallacy to do with the structure of the premises. So I think I tend to agree with you. You had me convinced.
Well, then I'll tell you where to send the check.
No, that's definitely okay. That's fantastic that you mentioned that. So now I can see where you're coming from.
But I'm not an expert in logic, informal logic. I took a few classes and we think about it all the time. But how many people are experts in all of these propositional, I mean, it's fantastic stuff. But when you live your daily life, are you really digging down that deep in what we would call formal logic? A few people maybe, but
Yeah, formal logic is quite limited. We're talking about non sequitur and to do with the structure. Most of the fallacies that occur to us on a day-to-day basis are informal ones, and they're not deliberate unless you are a professional debater. Some actually accuse the examples of William Lane Craig and quite established thinkers that would actually use logical fallacies on purpose to deceive an audience or to sort of circumvent a certain situation. But I would tend to think most of the logical fallacies would occur unintentionally based on issues with the way our brains evolved.
so I just thought of an example. If P then Q. If it's raining, then Hani Salim goes outside with an umbrella. It is raining, therefore Hani Salim is outside with an umbrella. That's logical. But what if I said it's not raining, therefore Hani Salim is not carrying an umbrella? That doesn't follow, does it? You flipped it, but it's not, because there's other reasons why you might be outside with an
Yeah,
umbrella
because
besides the
for the
fact that
sun to block the sun, for example.
yeah, who knows why? Maybe you're giving a gift to somebody. Who knows? But it doesn't follow. But in formal logic, if we're not careful in formal logic, we can make an assumption that it follows when it doesn't, and so we make a formal fallacy.
Correct. Yes. No, I tend to agree with that. Okay, so we'll move along from there and we get into the book because this is quite interesting. And on purpose, you tell us about the your initial struggle because you had few people asking you. First, it evolved from an article to a book, but most complaints were around, "Oh, that's not long enough. They needed
Yeah.
more
So,
pages."
so when we were driving down the coast of California, it was somewhere along that coast where I realized postduction is the wrong word. It was stupid because I was just, thinking, ad libbing, and I realized contraduction would be better. So when we got to Santa Barbara, Annie, Laurie, and I, we checked into the Cheshire Cat Inn and Cottages, or Cheshire Cat Hotel. It's a big old historic building. It's beautiful there. And we checked into the Tweedledum Suite. And I was thinking about Alice in Wonderland and realities, and I realized contraduction is just this big grin on an invisible cat. Basically, it's not really there. So I sat down that next morning. I got to write this down. I'm going to write an article. So I started writing, and I thought I would write an article in a day or two, and send it off to a magazine. But it kept growing and growing, and it took weeks and then months, and I kept thinking, well, I need to add this, I need to add that. Finally, I came up with an article, like maybe 10, 11,000 words. And I showed it to some magazines and periodicals, and, they usually don't reply. But when they did, they said it was too long. Could I shorten it? So I thought, well, maybe it's so long that it could be a short book. So I sent it to a couple of publishers, and I said, I have this short book, but they said it was too short for a book. And finally, a publisher, Hypatia Press, finally said, we can do something with this. There's ways to make a short book. And you've read little short monographs of books,
Yes.
that are, I mean, they're kind of fun to have a little short book, and they can fatten it up. And so once they said yes, and once I got a contract, and I'm the working title right now is Contraduction, the Hidden Fallacy That Inverts Reality. Once they said yes, and then it switched from article to book, then I thought, oh, great. So then that gave me breathing room. And so basically it's doubled now because new examples. And then readers, I've sent it out to like 40 different readers, smart people. The philosopher A.C. Grayling, if you know him, out of
Course.
London,
Yeah.
he read it, and he gave me a big thumbs up and a good blurb on it. And he even made some suggestions. He even had some criticisms, which I thought was good, because I think a book like this needs criticism. I'm sure a lot of readers are going to say this is wrong or this is wrong. And if I sent it to after I did my debate in Oxford last November on the existence of God, one of the very bright Oxford students who was for the opposition, who was against our position, he had argued for the fine-tuning argument as the best argument. And in fact, he's right. It is the best. Not that it's the best, but it's the one that you have to work with.
Mm-hmm.
He was generous enough to read a manuscript of this new book, and he offered some criticisms, which I found very useful. In fact, he saved me some embarrassment. He's one of these really bright Oxford students. And he said, well, I don't think I'm paraphrasing, I don't think this chapter 3 is contraductive. And I think chapter 7 maybe is not, but these others are. And so I was happy because even though he was disagreeing with a particular point or two, he was buying the concept. You know what I
Yes.
mean? He was using the word contraduction
Mm-hmm.
as a meaningful word to frame how we're talking about things. So I think that was a success. And I'm sure there will be readers who say, "Oh, your chapter on time is totally off the rails," but I loved your chapter about sleep. So I'm really inviting a dialogue with this book.
Yeah, considering as well you're covering so many sciences in the process of looking at everything that is contraductive, you've gone all the way from I think the one that is most interested me was time the concept because it's quite problematic anyway as it is.
Yeah.
All the way to evolution and cosmology. So you cover so many sciences in there. So definitely some expert opinion on the different topics would benefit the book for sure.
Yeah, but since you read a manuscript too, that I'm not claiming to go into great depth. I mean, any of
Yes.
those chapters should be a huge, you know what I mean? The point of it is not to analyze to death those issues, but it's just to illustrate contradiction in some way or another, whether you agree or not. Causality, sleep, and design, and it's really a book about the design argument. And I think you suggested that a good subtitle for the book would be "The Death of Design" or "The Death Blow to the Design Argument," which might be a
Yes.
good selling. That might be a good selling title.
I think so. I think so. I think because I think this is Christopher Hitchens, Sean Carroll himself. He said this is the only viable argument because it plays by the rules. It's got 20 physical constants, and if they're tweaked by one hair, there might be not the universe that we live in. But the one thing is we don't know what kind of universe we can be living in. So, for example, carbon. It's the glue in the organic compounds. It glues atoms together and it creates complex groupage of different elements and it can do that. But the silicon can do something similar. So it could have been in a silicon life form. So we don't know what if the knobs were tweaked a little bit, maybe we can end up with a different type of reality. But we can only talk about the reality that allowed us here to exist, and these are the cases. But was it made for us to exist? Was the hole made for the water to fit in? Or was the hole going to be always there, and by some other laws the water condensed and dropped in terms of raindrops and filled up the hole just for the water to see how wonderful this hole is fitting? And
Huh.
that could be the issue.
Yeah. Well, you're right about the fine tuning argument being their best shot. And Christopher Hitchens said it doesn't prove anything. It's not a good argument, but you got to think about it. You can't just dismiss it like you can other arguments. And Hitchens said you have to spend some time on it. And other thinkers have said the same thing. And I quote a lot of uh, even theistic philosophers and scientists and some atheistic ones who agree the fine tuning argument, which is basically the idea that if any one of these constants or parameters or ratios of the physical forces and the cosmological constant and so on, if any of them were even slightly off by the tiniest amount, we would be living in a universe that was not life permitting. It would be horrible. Either galaxies would never form, or whatever, or carbon could not form, and so they're right about it. But that's kind of like saying Um, if the state border had been even slightly off the river, then it would not have perfectly fine-tuned, then it would not be a border on the river. It's a backward kind of thinking. And there's a great book out by Victor Stenger. He's an astrophysicist. He died about 10 years ago, but he and I were friends. And I quote some things that he wrote. And in his one of his books is called The Fallacy of Fine Tuning.
Mm.
And the big takeaway from his book is that he says, the universe was not fine-tuned for us. We were fine-tuned for the universe. It's backwards. It's like the person who is amazed. Look how perfectly the shape of the human nose is designed to support a pair of eyeglasses. How do you explain that? How, look at how perfectly that is. Well, of course, that's backwards. It's silly. The nose came first, and then the eyeglasses were designed to fit the nose. And evolution by natural selection, it doesn't mean that the nature that you and I are living in right now was not adapted to fit us. We were adapted to fit the nature that we live in. This is who we are because of the nature that we live in. So the fine-tuning argument, I argue, is a contraductive argument. It gets things backwards. It's reversing. We sometimes hear about the anthropic principle, which means really the only universe that could have, the only kind of universe we could observe is the universe that would have the observers in it. You know what I mean? It's a self-reflexive kind of a thought.
Yeah.
So, and the examples I'm giving in the book are not always necessarily related to design. I do have a chapter called Design, which we could talk about, but they're related to not whether God exists or not. I mean, that's a good question, but they're related to really how are our brains actually working? That's the question. How do our brains work, and why do we get so many things wrong? And it's natural. We have to assume, because we're organisms that care about ourselves, we have to assume everything is from our point of view, either our own self-centered point of view or our own self-selected point of view as we look at the world. And that's where I think the informal fallacy happens. We get it wrong because we think it's about us, like a little infant thinks everything's about me, feed me. That's how we think as human beings. Everything's about us. And so we flip things around to make it all about us.
Yes. Do you think this is to do with the hyperactive agency detection, something that sort of we evolved, the false positive or the type 1 error, where we must infer an intelligence or a design or a desire or a plan behind things in order to survive, because presuming otherwise, the rustling in the trees sort of analogy, those who fled in the absence of evidence or without the ability to verify what's the source of the sound, we are the offspring of these people because they've fled the scene, and maybe that's probably the logical thing to do at the time, absence of the method to verify the source of sounds. But it's stayed persistent in the human minds that every single sound, every single action, every single occurrence must be designed for some purpose.
Or for our purpose,
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the hyperactive agency detector thing is one very popular hypothesis to explain the origin of religion. Obviously, it's safer to assume agency even if there's not. You're safer doing that than doing the reverse. Like what you said, if you hear a rustling in the grass, it could be the wind blowing, right? Or it could be a predator. So which mistake should you make if you want to survive, right? You should assume the worst. And most of the time you're going to be wrong, but you're still going to assume the worst because those ancestors of ours who made the opposite assumption didn't survive to pass on their characteristics or instincts to us. And so that's just natural selection, basically. And so when you look at the moon, you see a face. And when you, I remember I was out shoveling snow in the winter here in Wisconsin, and I was over by the driveway, and then I was startled. There was a person standing next to me. Oh, but it was just the trash bin. It was just the trash bin. But we all do that, don't we? Our brains we assume there's agency there when there's not. And so maybe thunder, the ancients thought thunder was a god, or the volcanoes was a goddess, or you know what I mean? We assume that because we're probably more likely to survive if we keep making that mistake over time. And we can't help it. We're stuck with it. We evolved that. And maybe contraduction is one of those byproducts of those instincts that we inherited from our ancestors.
So in a time where you can now have access to verify the information without endangering yourself, has what once was a beneficiary um, illusion has become more of an obstacle in today's world?
Well, I guess it could be if it keeps you from doing something you should do, if you're afraid, because, uh, but even if we could all be perfectly rational and scientific, let's assume the best about people. We're all, this is not true, but let's assume that people can be perfectly rational and think it through scientifically. And I know that that trash can is not really a person. We're still stuck with those instincts.
Mm.
We can't just get rid of those instincts. Maybe we could go through a rigid training program to uninstinctivize ourselves. I don't know if that's even possible, but we still have those instincts. They're still with us as evolved primates. And so how we deal with them, or maybe we can train ourselves to ignore them. I don't know. Maybe we shouldn't ignore them. Maybe there's still some value in making those false assumptions, even in the modern world, even though we live in a different environment today than in which we evolved,
Yeah.
100,000 years ago.
Or if hardware disappear over time in evolution, like fastidious organs and stuff like that, like the tail, maybe on the software level, evolution also over a long period of time sort of gets rid of that.
Well,
If it doesn't get used over a long period of time, it might get dropped.
well,
And
it might be, but there would have to be some selective pressure there, giving an advantage to those who breed without that instinct. I don't know. Maybe that's possible. What would you call that? Theoretical natural selection, or theoretical?
I'm just thinking right now, like right when you said where those people who did the right logical thing to do, absence of the tools to verify the sound from trees. But now in today's world, we know that societies that have beliefs not mirroring the reality, they're at a disadvantage. So if you're in Afghanistan at the moment and you have a worldview of certain things, you will have certain practices, you'll have certain culture that will evolve around that particular understanding. And if your views are not matching the natural world outside of you, eventually over time you will be at a disadvantage, and maybe over time you'll suffer the consequences of such belief that is not matching reality.
But that would have to translate into a reproductive disadvantage in some way, where your offspring therefore are less likely to compete or survive in the world, allowing those with another worldview to do better. I don't know. That's
Very true. I know what you mean, because as we speak now, actually, I'm an anti-natalist, and we don't have children, and we decided not to have children. And if those who don't have beliefs mirroring reality decide to have a dozen, then they still achieved what evolution wanted them to do. So they win.
Well, yeah, maybe I think you're right, and we need to lower the population for a lot of reasons. Assuming technology can't keep up. But so people who are more rational and scientific, if they're having fewer children, well, how does that going to help nudge natural selection? You know what I mean?
Yes, it is. It is a catch-22 for sure. It looks like the simpletons will inherit the earth.
Well, and you know what? I don't know if we should. I mean, some of them are simpletons. But I think everybody is capable of thinking rationally with good training and good examples. But
Yeah,
but I get your point. Yeah.
I tend to agree. I actually think most religious people who make all these fallacies when it comes to verification and all that sort of stuff, when it comes to issues of faith, put them in front of a car dealership where they're buying a second-hand car, and they become David Hume. suddenly wanting to examine the car and making sure it works perfectly because they're gonna pay their hard-earned money, and suddenly they're they're Hume, they're David Hume, they're so critical of everything.
Yeah.
So
Well,
yeah, I tend to agree. I think you're right. Even those type of people are still very capable of being critical when it's needed.
and when the car breaks down, they're not going to call a witch doctor or a faith healer.
Like, go back
they,
to, where's, give me back
they're
my
gonna
money.
they're gonna do something rational and practical to get their car to work.
Yes, yes, yeah, for sure. Um, the on the chapter where you talked about time, that was very interesting to me because it requires us for time to be contraductive, the way at least we look at it. We need to look at it in a different way, where time is not a river that's flowing; it is us that is actually the markers of time. So time doesn't actually exist the way we think it is. If it's a measurement of change in the system, we are the finite beings within that system that live within certain arrow of times, and therefore we are the time.
Yeah, and I think this is the most controversial chapter in the book. And again, I welcome the controversy. So just like we think the sun is rising when it's not the sun that's rising, we are rising. I think we can picture time as we imagine time is flowing, but maybe time is not flowing. Maybe there's no such thing as time. Maybe we are flowing, and that's what we mean by time. Maybe there was no past and no future. Maybe there's only now, and there's change in a constant now. Certainly, my great grandparents lived in their now, and we live in our now. And maybe time is not flowing at all. Maybe it's entropy in the second law of thermodynamics. Is since the Big Bang, things are, entropy is increasing, and so it
Disorder.
is that overall increase in entropy in the physical world, we kinetic objects that live in this world, we are not acting in time as if time were a stage or a backdrop against which we are measuring things. Our very acting, our very change, the very entropy, the very all of that is what we mean by time. Time is measuring not distance. Time is measuring change.
Changes. Yeah.
Like when you celebrate your birthday, you mean the Earth has gone one revolution around the sun, right? Tick, 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 and it's an arbitrary thing, obviously. And it is that movement that is time. It's not measuring time. That's what we mean by time. And so it's a pretty long chapter, and I can't go into too much depth. I might be totally off base, but to give an example of what might be a contraductive thinking, we are imagining that time is this thing. But what is time? Time is a dimension. And what is a dimension? A dimension is not a thing. Where exactly is height? There's no line in the universe that is height. It depends on your frame of reference. You have to establish a frame of reference, and then you set a 0 point, and then you come up with some unit of measurement, and then you can say you can talk about this thing is this high, right? But there's no height in the universe. There's not a thing. And so height, the three physical dimensions, and time as a dimension, which Einstein showed us, time, there's no line that we can call time anywhere. It's not ticking. It's not there. It's not a river. It's just once you establish a frame of reference, then you can talk about the change that's happening. And then the fact that we are growing older, you and I are growing older, but we're not growing older in time. Like when you go from a toddler to an adult, you have traveled through height, like you've traveled through something. Growing older is the definition of time. It's reversed. So instead of thinking of time as something that we are in, contraductively, we flip it and say, well, time is something that is in us. There's more to say about that, but that's kind of the rough idea of what I'm grappling for an illustration to show what a contradiction might be.
Yes, that's why I think you're right, and I think, and that's why we have the A and B theories of time, and Isaac Newton thought time was fixed and fundamental, and it cannot be changed, and uh, Einstein showed how relative time was and how actually it can change and it dilates if you're away from gravity or you move close to the speed of light, and how the speed of light is constant. You put the speed of light of 300,000 kilometers a second in front of a train that is moving 1,000 kilometers in a second. You don't add 1,000 plus 300,000; it stays constant. So things like that is mind-boggling, but it is a reality. And the idea of time, from physics point of view, I've heard mixed opinions on that. Whether it's fundamental, whether it's intertwined with space, and it cannot be isolated. How is it different from the arrow of time? And then the philosophical implications of it, the A and B theory of time, is are we living presentism or eternalism or all these sort of implications. But you're right, all these things mean nothing absence of the human consciousness that puts the marker to say this is when this situation I was born. What does that mean? What is 1972? It's that date is not fixed in time. It actually measures something that is relevant to me. I'm measuring my own events using the time marker. So therefore, the time marker is not. It's exactly like the kilometers and the meters and centimeters. These are not a priori. We devise them to make sense of the world around us, and I think time might end up being something like that, and it might not be. I'm open to all sort of explanations at this point, but it's definitely a topic worthy of a conversation.
The only thing I'm trying to question here is whether we can talk about time as something that's flowing, like talking about the sun rising, when it could be the other way around. It could be that we are what's flowing and time isn't. And so we're always in a constant now. Stephen Hawking said, and I think I quote him in the book, that the greatest proof we have that time travel is not possible is that we have not been invaded by hordes of tourists from the future, right? They would want to come back to here.
Yeah.
And I make an argument that the whole idea of time travel is not only impossible, it's incoherent. It's not something you can travel at all. It's not a thing. It's not a path. It's not like, and then there's all these practical problems with time travel. In order for me to travel to 1895, northern Oklahoma, when my grandfather was born, I would have to travel through space to the point where the Earth was in 1895, which is what, half a trillion miles away from here. So you can't just travel through time. You'd also have to travel through space. By the time you got there, how much time would have elapsed anyway? And then there's the paradox. What if I killed my grandfather before he had children? Then would I be born?
You wouldn't be making the trip, yeah?
Yeah, and in which case he wouldn't have been killed. In which case I would have been born. In which case he would have been killed. So it's a paradox.
Yeah.
Not to mention the moral issue of pathogens, being introduced to novel or introducing novel pathogens to somebody. If we went back to 1895, we would probably infect everybody with stuff that we've evolved, and that's what happened when the Europeans colonized Americas. They brought with them these pathogens to which they had time to resist, but the natives didn't, and something like 95%. I'm a member of an American Indian tribe, and we just barely went down to less than 1,000 members back in the year 1900 because of that, the pathogens. So I'm arguing time is not a thing. Time is not, even though the ancient Greeks and Romans had a god, Kronos, they thought Kronos was an actual god, a thing, I don't think it is. I think time is just a concept in our heads. It's a conventional thing. 1972 is just a human convention that we all agree to. Was that your birth year?
1972. I was born 1972.
Oh, there you go. Okay. So it's a convention that we use, and other countries use different calendars. So as long as we all know what we're talking about, we can say, I don't think we should jettison the word sunrise. It's a perfectly good word. We know that literally it doesn't mean what it says. We all know that. The sun is not rising, but hey, you know what I mean when I say sunrise, right? So yes. I don't have to change the word to mean something else. We understand that we have these conventions of talk, and I don't think there's such a thing as a past or the future, but I think we can use those words past and future because we know what we mean when we're talking about those things.
The one thing about time travel, for sure, we know in physics it's impossible to go back in the past because of entropy. There are so many ways to break an egg, but there's no way to unbreak an egg. So it's going to be very difficult because of the disorder that's created by entropy to go back in time. But
Yeah.
physics contain and they're okay with going into the future. As a matter of fact, in general relativity has introduced the twin paradox with time dilation, where a twin astronaut will actually go and travel and will end up returning back to his twin brother a few seconds younger.
Yeah.
So it is possible. We're talking zip 2 seconds and stupid, like fragments of seconds. It's not huge, but over long distances and close to the speed of light, we could the difference could be vast. But traveling into the future is a possibility. And even when you've mentioned about looking into the stars, you're looking into something that is taking the light from about 5 million years. Maybe the stars have been dead 2 million years ago, but you still see the light that is coming from it, which is quite a thing when you think about it.
Yeah. And that photon itself was not on some long extended road trip across
It
the
doesn't experience
vast
time.
darkness
Yeah.
before it hits your retina. When you're looking at that photon and that photon hits your eye, you are not looking into the past, you're looking into now. In other words, you're seeing the star as it was in its own now. And when it hits your eye now, and that photon itself, traveling at the speed of light, experiences no time. So if you were to ask the photon, hey, how was your trip across the vast cold space? It would say, what trip? It wasn't
Yeah.
making a trip. And that's weird at the speed of light, what things that happen. But back to what you said about entropy, which I think entropy is basically what we mean by time and how we establish an arrow of time, basically, because things tend to get more disordered as, in a closed system. Entropy is a macro level concept. It deals with huge quantities of particles and things. But at the subatomic level, there actually are some experiments that show that some particles, like the tachyon, for example, actually can go backward in time, or it can actually travel faster than the speed of light, which means that at that level, you can maybe talk sensibly about brief time travel. But you and I, as biological organism with trillions upon trillions of cells and atoms that are all working, any of those fluctuations are going to cancel out. At the macro level, in order for that principle to apply to you or me of time travel at the subatomic level, every single subatomic particle in your body would have to travel backward in time at the same rate for an extended period of time, so that, I mean, what are the odds that every single one of them would happen? Like, what are the odds that every air molecule in your room would all move over to the right side of the room? That could happen.
It's possible. Yeah.
It could happen, but I mean, what are the chances of that?
Yeah, this I think we've got a mass anyway. You've got to be massless to be able to do that, and even the light doesn't travel at that speed unless it's in a vacuum. So you can actually impede, like in water and stuff like that, and slow down. And still, from the frame of reference, even though the photon would experience no time to reach from the sun to us, however, it takes 8 minutes and 20 seconds. Based on our calculation, because it's always the inertial frame of reference, as Einstein sort of taught us. So it's relevant, like a person falling into a black hole. To that person falling into the black hole, they will experience time as normal. But from the observer point of view, they'll see a slowdown, a gradual slowdown, until almost frozen at the event horizon. So it's crazy how time is perceived differently from different inertial point of view.
Now, what I think is crazy, and Einstein saw it, I don't know how early, but Einstein saw it with E equals mc squared. The only constant in that equation is c, the speed of light. The others are variable. Mass and energy can change and vary, and they can change into each other, which is what's happening inside the stars that produce those photons. But so C is the constant, but c is the speed of light. So how weird is it that all of reality is based on something called speed? Speed's not a thing. Speed is not, you can't see speed. I mean, you can deduce it from objects moving a certain rate through time and that, but speed is just speed and time are interrelated. Speed, distance over time, and speed,
Yeah.
they are non-physical things that rely on each other. The only thing that really exists would be the distance. That's an actual measuring thing. So speed and time are these non things that somehow become the constant that roots the reality that we live in. That just seems weird to me.
Yeah, they're arbitrary measures, you know. I think they're useful because, like for example, I think they're using now the unit because in astrospace the distances are huge. You can't use kilometers, so they use the distance between the Earth and the Sun, which is I believe it's 150 million kilometers, as the unit. They call it the universal unit, the UA, to measure areas in space. Otherwise, kilometers and mileage, these won't do. They need a different unit of measurement. So
I
in
think it's
quantum
called
mechanics,
the astronomical unit, isn't it? The
yeah,
AU.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's incredible how we keep devising these different type of they're handy tools. Are they are they discovered? They're not discovered. They're designed. They're made to make our life easy. For you and I, when we have a conversation, we know what we're talking about because we've agreed a unit of measure that we understand. When I say kilometer, when I say a meter, but are they there in the universe for us to discover? I don't think so.
The distance between the Earth and the Sun is there. I mean, it's a distance, but using it as a unit of measurement is a convention that we agree on, right? And
Correct.
the meter was supposed to be what, 1/10,000th of the distance between the North Pole and the equator, something like
Yeah.
that. It was supposed to be an exact physical thing based on only our Earth. So, intelligent life on another planet would have a different distance, and so their meter would be different from ours. So it's a convention. If we're going to measure things, we've got to come up with some kind of an agreement. Otherwise, I could cheat you really good when I'm selling you some quantities. you know.
Yes. Yeah. And it's so funny. Some of it is by accident. Like there was a duodecimal, the unit of 12, and the octal decimal in terms of units. But we ended up with the decimal system because we're not Simpsons and we don't have four fingers on each hand. You know, if you're a
And
Simpson, you end up with the octal decimal. But it's very handy because we can count on our 10 fingers, and the
yeah,
decimal system is quite convenient that way.
yeah, and it just so happens to match in God's mind because of the Ten Commandments and the 10 plagues of Egypt. I mean, that number 10 must be God's number.
There are some magical numbers: the 3, the 7, the 10. There are 12. There are some numbers actually sort of keep repeating as if they're. I think the number 7 has been talked about as if it contains the two primal numbers of 3 and 4, and the triangle and the square, and these put together create a magical number in geometry because the theory of forms and shapes, it's a platonic in nature, and these two numbers combined together become 7, and it becomes a super magical number that explains everything. So it's like,
I
so
think I think 12 is much more useful though because it has more factors than 10. 12 is a great, and of course then 36 and then 60, any multiples of 12, and then where we get 360 degrees in a circle is a multiple of 12. So I think you have more ways to break it up into nice pie shapes that are even if you use the multiple of 12 or 60 or 360. I think a true evidence of intelligent design, this is getting off the point a little bit, but a true evidence of fine tuning would be if the Earth revolved around the sun exactly 360 days instead of 365.24.
yeah.
Imagine if our calendar was exactly 12 months of 30 days each and it never varied. It was perfect. To me, that would be an amazing evidence toward the existence of an intelligent designer. Instead, we have this sloppy calendar where we have to add a leap day, and we have to
Yeah.
take off at the every 400 every century that doesn't multiply by. I mean, this is weird. It's not. It's sloppy. It's not very well designed. But look how close to 360 it is. And I imagine that the ancients in Mesopotamia we're using that 360 and 12, and then there's 12 signs of the zodiac, right? There's 12 that go around. There's 12 hours in a day, or 24 hours in a day, and there's 12 segments. And that seems to me a much
Elegant. Yeah.
a much better way of keeping track of numbers than the number 10.
Yeah. Considering even the day 24 hours didn't even exist until the little planet that hit our Earth and split, and the rules of gravity created our satellite we call the moon, and therefore the day stabilized into 24 hours. Before that, it wasn't even that. It was quite a turbulent existence on Earth before then. So
The hours are just arbitrary. We could have picked any number. We could have
true.
picked 17. I mean, but for some reason, it's nice to pick a number that has many factors in it. That's a
Yeah.
nice. It just makes it's more elegant to do it that way than to pick 17 hours in a day or 23 or something. But
Yeah,
like a prime number.
completely agree. Now we've got like 5 minutes to go, and I think I'd like to spend it in one of the most important areas of your book. And I'm trying to leave areas in your book for people to make sure they get their hands on once it's published, because there's so much more to this. We're just grabbing bits and pieces and some nuggets from the book. But it's the Kalam cosmological argument. It's the William Lane Craig reinvented Al Ghazali Kalam cosmological argument. What do you think about it?
Yeah, so I think, and I have a whole chapter in another book about that. In my book, Godless, I call it cosmological calamity. Um, but calamity. I think, and this is outside of this next book, but it's comparing apples and oranges. So the Kalam says everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. That is a valid argument. That's a valid conclusion. But is it a sound conclusion? Are those premises actually true? And in this particular book that's coming out, the contradiction book, I'm examining that second premise. The universe began to exist. What do we even mean by the word began, for one thing? I mean, what is that? Like your life began in 1972. What does that mean? Did something in the universe click and now it began, right? We use the word begin in all these different kinds of ways. And besides the fact that when we come up with the concept of things that begin to exist had a cause, where that principle comes from within the observable universe. We notice things that begin to exist, whatever we mean by begin, and whatever we mean by cause. What was the cause of the American Revolution? What do we know? But we find this principle within the universe. Can we therefore take that principle and apply it to the universe as a whole, to the set as a whole, as if that set were a member of itself, as if the universe itself were also a thing that is subject to the laws of cause and effect? Can we even do that? All right. But so I raise those questions in that other chapter. But in contradiction, that second premise, did the universe begin to exist at the Big Bang, Big Bang cosmology? And I think contradictively, we can flip that around. We think of the Big Bang as a creation from nothing, right? That's what we think of. There was a beginning, and then suddenly here comes the universe creating from nothing. I think we can flip that around and think of it as a non-creation from everything. Whatever the singularity was, and there's big debate about the singularity, is it just theoretical, or was there actually a point of infinite density and in zero dimension? Did that actually happen? Maybe not. But whatever that was not nothing. So I think instead of thinking of the universe beginning there and then expanding and creating, we should flip it around. Like what happens when you heat a pot of water to boiling and then you turn off the heat? It doesn't drop immediately to room temperature. It cools, and the bubbles continue to arise for a while, but they get smaller and cooler until it eventually drops. And I think that's what's happening since. And I'm instead of calling it the Big Bang, I'm calling it the Big Bust. There was this beginning. There was this point. Let's not call it a beginning because there wasn't even any time then. And now we are writing it down. We are cooling down. We are not. We're not. We're not being created from nothing. We are in a process of non-creation from everything. So the phrase "the universe began to exist" might be a bad premise. We might better say the universe began not to exist. And we happen to be in one of those little bubbles that is still temporarily rising next to a sun, which is still in giving us energy for a while during this big overall cooling down. For a while, we have the illusion that things are creating and getting better. Whereas in the big picture, the universe did not begin to exist. And if that's true, then the Kalam logic fails, at least at that level. And there are objections to my criticism, and I try to address those as well in the book.
I completely agree with you. I don't think this was the point at the beginning. It's widely debated now. I think that we don't know where the singularities come from, whether it's an older collapsed universe or whatever, but there was something. It was not nothing. And you can argue that the birth of a person could be the marker of a birth of a person or the beginning of the journey of his or her death. So
Yeah.
it could be, and that could be and as you said, as the water cools down in the boiling water, and so is our thermal universe. It's actually cooling down, and that's the expected death of the universe. Is going to be a thermal death of cooling, and things are so far away from each other that energy is not dissipated and watered down and diluted, and therefore I think your analogy is quite correct. It's the and whether that end means that there's another. There's a collapse, and then it creates another singularity at some point, as is known as the Big Bounce or the Big Crunch universe, or the cyclic universes. So it's incredible. We don't know.
So regardless of all those details, and maybe I'm wrong about some of them, it is an illustration of contraduction. Instead of thinking of it going this way, it's actually going the other direction.
Yes, agreed. I think so. I think you've displayed. I think I've got you got me convinced now, and I love your book for what it is because every single element you were able to display the contraductive, and I think we need to get started using to coin that term, and I think I'm going to be using it then from this point on. It makes sense now,
Well, that's
as you
good.
explained.
If
Yeah,
we had, do we have any time left here, or?
yeah. Please, yeah. If you want to add
Oh,
anything.
well, so Steven Pinker, him, the great thinker. He wrote the book Rationality and the Blank Slate. He read this book and he gave it a huge thumbs up, a big endorsement, which I think the publisher's going to put on the cover, because Steven Pinker, um, he happens to be the editor of the American Heritage Dictionary, and so there's a really long shot chance. You can't tell the dictionary what to do. But
Yes.
if people like you and others start saying, yeah, I like that word, let's use it, maybe in 10 or 20 years, that word will find its way into the dictionary. So I hope Pinker lives for 10 or 20 more years. He'll probably live for 40 more years. So that'll work.
That's how words sort of get sort of created. I mean, if the younger people creates the word sick to mean something cool, then we can we can add contraductive as
Well, okay. I mean, it could happen. That's not one of my dreams. If Richard Dawkins can invent the word meme and now it's all over the place,
true.
right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
pretty amazing. I mean, how many people can say they've done something like that? That's incredible.
This is fantastic.
Hmm.
As ever, Dan. Yeah, conversations with you, I wish they never end because I feel like I could speak with you for hours. But I urge people to go into the description of the video to see all Dan's the website, the pages, and all his work, his Wikipedia page as well, to see his work over the decades of hard work. And hopefully when this book comes out, I might invite you again, and then we talk about the final version of it, and probably publish it properly and advertise it to the rest of the people with a link for them to purchase at some point.
Well, it's always fun. Besides being a smart guy, you're just a fun guy to talk to, Andy.
Oh, thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. I do. I was always telling my wife, I think I'm a sapiosexual.
Ah,
Yeah, so I'm always interested in smart people. My wife is very, very smart. She's even smarter than me, and she's an atheist as well, by the way. Very similar story to yours, by the way. She's Aussie, and yeah, I feel that there are a lot of similarities in the journey.
wow. Yeah. Well, we're all learning, aren't we? I hope we're all learning and going. Um,
Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, folks, for tuning in today. Please stay tuned for once the book is published. We'll let everybody know, and I'll be the first to buy it and read it at its final version. Thanks very much.